Whether it's trail running on the slopes of Mount Timpanogos, exploring the canyons of the San Rafael Swell, devouring the latest prize-winning history book, or hosting a scholarly lecture on campus, Brenden does it with enthusiasm. Brenden is the creator of the web and mobile-based public history archive, Intermountain History, that is hosted at the Red Center. He is the co-editor of 2 volumes of the Joseph Smith Papers. He's the co-author with Jay Buckley of the Historical Dictionary of the American Frontier. And Jay is the person who he credits with luring him into Western history in the first place. And so I'm indebted to Jay for that. He's also the co-editor with Jane Hafen of the forthcoming American Indians and Mormons. And he is the author of the forthcoming Native but Foreign, Transnational Cree, Chippewa, and Yaqui Refugees and Immigrants in the U.S. Canadian and U.S. Mexican Borderlands from 1880 to the present, being published this year by Texas A&M University Press. So I give you Brenden Rensink.
Well, thank you to Brian for that introduction, and I should say maybe I have Jay Buckley to blame, not to thank, for luring me into this field. It's a pleasure to speak with you today. I'm really grateful for this opportunity. I'm also grateful to the Kennedy Center and the Latin American Studies for some funding they're providing to help me over the course of this spring and summer present portions of this research to scholarly groups in 5 different countries in Europe. If you think here in the United States we have a preoccupation with borders and with migration, imagine in Europe where you're at no more than 200 or 250 miles most from an international border, probably much closer and probably within the proximity to multiple international borders, currently facing all kinds of crises over immigration and refugees. So I'm very excited to be able to travel there and engage with those groups of scholars. To start today, I want to begin with 2 very brief Borderlands biographies. Much of this talk will be zoomed out to kind of a macro level comparative history unfolding over broad regional geographies and across decades and even centuries. So I feel it's important to first pause for a moment and to dive into a couple micro histories, to imbue the subsequent discussion with some intimate examples that can ground us, can help us put a face on these stories that we'll talk about at kind of a broader, more macro level. The first is that of a Chippewa named Penato. In 1911, he contacted a longtime friend and ally in Montana, Frank B. Linderman. Linderman was a former fur trapper, turned assayer, turned insuranceman, turned Montanan state legislator, turned very popular author. And he was a man of great prominence and influence in Montana. Penato, this Chippewa, was the brother of Rocky Boy, a Chippewa chief who, along with Crees under the leadership of Chief Little Bear, had been living in Montana for decades, landless, wandering around the state. And this happening in a time when the United States no longer accepted the presence of wandering Indians. This is well into the stages of reservation confinement, of assimilation programs. So they were very much an anomaly. But they've been labeled as foreign Indians, Canadian Indians, and therefore were not integrated into those systems. Penato and Rocky Boy's band had been temporarily settled on the Blackfeet Reservation the year prior, but conditions had been so poor there that they had renounced their allotments and returned to their transient patterns around Montana. But Penato had an idea in 1911. There was a recently decommissioned military reserve, the Fort Assiniboine Military Reserve, and he thought that maybe this could be used as lands for a new reservation for these landless Crees and Chippewas. Moreover, these lands included the very important Bear Paw Mountains. A Chippewa tribal tradition held that Rocky Boy's father had received a vision decades prior, appointing Montana as their future home, and specifically the Bear Paw Mountains as, quote, a rich place to raise their children and grandchildren. Little Bear, the Cree chief who was associated with some of these movements, had also had a vision while in Canada, where a figure pointed southward to the land of the Big Knife. and pointed, and Little Bear looked south and saw, in vision, the Bear Paw Mountains. So this idea that Panato had come up with was going to hold some resonance. Lindeman enthusiastically agrees and directs Panato to return from where he was in Great Falls back to the Blackfeet Reservation, where a delegation from D.C. was about to arrive. And he thought maybe we can broach the subject there. Panato responded, "I will go wherever these soldiers take me, if you tell me and you wish me to go. But if I go to Browning on the Blackfeet Reservation, I shall die there within 10 days. Lindeman recalled, "This was the last time I saw him." He died, as he had predicted, within 10 days after reaching his destination. A tragic end, but Panato had planted the seed of an idea that would come to fruition a few years later with the creation of a new reservation. A couple thousand miles south, in the U.S.-Mexican borderlands, we have another story unfolding during some of these very same years, about the family of a young Yaqui girl named Fermania, who struggled through precarious conditions in the U.S.-Mexican borderlands of Sonora and Arizona, living in conditions of poverty and much struggle with her people. During the turn of the century, there had been wars between Yaquis in Sonora and the regime of Porfirio Diaz. The Diaz regime had instituted campaigns of extermination against the Yaquis and paired this with capturing many others, including women, children, and the elderly, deporting them to the Yucatan and other points south, and selling them into slavery as slave laborers on henequen and sisal plantations in southern Mexico. It's in this context that Ferminia's grandparents were deported south and died. To escape this brutality, Ferminia's great-grandmother took 3 of her grandchildren and walked north, covertly across the U.S.-Mexican border, to join other Yaquis who had by then established familiar routes up to Yaqui settlements in southern Arizona. When she was born in 1915, her parents had 14 children, of which only 4 had survived. Her father at the time was working in a mine, and they lived in Sasco, Arizona. They then moved to Tucson, where he worked construction, and eventually to Murito, outside of Marana, where he worked a number of jobs. And she recalled a difficult childhood, fording flooded rivers and canals just to make it to school, where she did end up finishing up through the 6th grade. And her family was just one of thousands who fled Sonora over the course of over a century, struggled to find stable lives in Arizona, fiercely independent about their indigenous Yaqui identity, but not recognized as Indians in the United States. Both of these stories unfold across the U.S.-Canadian and U.S.-Mexican borders, and I'm convinced that it's along these frontiers, bordered lands, that some of the most compelling and dramatic human stories unfold in history. These are landscapes on the edges of empire, far removed at times from the centers of power, and sometimes offering opportunities not available at those cores of empire or nation. But they are simultaneously often the sites where empires and nations exert the most overt and violent forms of control and regulation. The people living in proximity to borders cannot ignore them, as they often impose hardship on them, and other times offer opportunity. Myself, I grew up on the border. If you can see here, Bellingham is a small town. Here's the border, so you can see where it's at. Here we have Washington. There's the town of Bellingham, the far northwest corner. And here we have Bellingham. Here's the 49th parallel of the U.S.-Canadian border. Does anyone see anything odd about the border? What do we have? Look at this. This strange little place called Point Roberts. Anyone been to Point Roberts before? Yeah, that's great. Oh, well, we have a lot to talk about then, Renata. Why not just draw the border around this place? Kids who live in, it's not a big community, but American children who live in Point Roberts have to be bused every day across the international border, around Boundary Bay, back across the international border to go to school in Blaine, and then back every single day. Right? It's nuts. But when they were drawing this line, one of the reasons they held strong and drew it across is because off of Point Roberts, there was access to very rich fisheries. Like, the salmon didn't respect the sanctity of the U.S.-Canadian border? No, right? Of course they didn't, right? As we've drawn these lines, so here we have the U.S.-Canadian border. This is Montana and future Alberta and Saskatchewan. And what do we have running across this line that's been drawn on the map? We have waterways and rivers, valleys. Farther east, we have the greater ecosystem of the Great Plains and the prairies. There's a natural world, and we have this juxtaposition of the supposed fixity of borders, with the obvious fact that the natural world doesn't pay attention to them, including people. Literal lines in the sand, lines on a map, we often disregard them. In the history of the establishment of this border and the U.S.-Mexican border, it's a wonder that U.S., Canadian, and Mexican officials were so surprised when people crossed these lines. In drawing the lines, we're attempting to impose order, define territories, define people as domestic or foreign, define jurisdiction over those peoples. But in so doing, we also invite chaos, because the very creation of a border invites people to transgress it. As borders, the imposition of borders, it creates differentials in power and opportunity. And there's real power in being able to cross that border, perhaps for a better life, perhaps to engage in illicit trade and contraband, right? Think about Prohibition era and all the rum running across the U.S.-Canadian border. Or perhaps to escape, which many have used the border for. And so here's the paradox. Creating a border for people to not cross also creates powerful reasons for people to cross, either legally or illegally. And what I have found most intriguing is the imposition of these borders over indigenous homelands and landscapes and natural worlds. Native landscapes which were in flux, which were under constant negotiation as they migrated and evolved. These are dynamic native worlds without these kind of fixed, hard borders. How are the Euro-American settler colonial projects of peopling these frontiers with white Americans, developing extractive industries, building towns, inviting white settlement, agriculture, attracting capital investment, at some point requires the subjugation and control of native peoples. They are incompatible in the views of the United States and Canada and many other nations with these settler colonial projects. So in the face of this violence, many natives look to the borders. They understand the meaning that Euro-Americans placed on the borders and sometimes used them to their advantage, leveraged them as a means to escape. We have a number of famous examples. In the 1850s, 1860s, you have groups such as Kickapoos, Lenapes, or Delawares, Shawnees, Seminoles, going not just to Oklahoma, but all the way south across Texas and all the way down into Mexico, searching for better treatment. In the 1860s through 1880s, Apaches like Geronimo and Cochise used the U.S.-Mexican border to raid and then cross back across the border, or to escape pursuit from the U.S. Army, even though we do eventually pursue them across the border. In 1877, Sitting Bull, this is after, not Wounded Knee, sorry, after Little Bighorn, goes to Canada, Wood Mountain, and he stays there for 4 years as he's granted asylum. Also in 1887, we have the story of Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce, who attempt to make it up and join Sitting Bull at Wood Mountain. They get within about 30 or 40 miles. They actually make it to the Bear Paw Mountains. So the border offered opportunity. But there are two groups which went in the wrong direction. Everyone's trying to get the heck out of Dodge, right? And there's two groups which decide to come into the United States. And it's in their history that I've discovered that the United States simply didn't have policy set for dealing with foreign Indians. There's no there's American Indians. What's this? There's no category for immigrants who are indigenous. And so these are the two groups I want to discuss today. Crees and Chippewas from Canada, who crossed into Mexico in the late 19th century, and Yaquis from Mexico, who crossed north into Arizona at roughly the same time. Exploring their histories can help us problematize our understanding of the settler colonial projects in Montana and Arizona, can help us understand how the United States did or did not address the presence of non-American Indians or foreign Indians. We can explore differences between the two borders, their enforcement regimes. We can study ways in which white Americans viewed the two borders differently, how they viewed Native peoples across the two borders differently as well. And together, we can come to a richer understanding of American state formation, and again, some of these huge blind spots concerning policies of immigration and Native peoples, because they're not normal immigrants, but they're also not normal Indians in the eyes of the United States. There's not a category for them. We'll move really quickly through a really brief overview. Crees and Chippewas originate predominantly from the Canadian East. Crees farther north up here along Hudson's Bay. Chippewas a little farther south down here between the Great Lakes and Lake Winnipeg. And starting in the 17th century, they started to engage in the fur trade, and they start to migrate westward across the plains all the way to the Rocky Mountains and increasingly south and southwest, coming well into territories that would later become the United States. And their presence is welcomed as fur traders. Lewis and Clark wrote of them, they are a wandering nation. They are well disposed towards whites. This is speaking of Crees specifically. And treat their traders with respect. They might probably be induced to visit an establishment on the Missouri at the Yellowstone River, right? Maybe we can get them to come down and trade with us instead of the Hudson's Bay Company to the north. So they were somewhat of a welcomed presence very early on. Yaquis in northwestern, what became northwestern Mexico, by the 19th century were kind of the last unconquered indigenous people in Mexico. And they had a long history of mobility and moving outward from the Yaqui River Valley as well. As early as 1732, they joined Catholic missions in Pimeria Alta and what became Arizona, at Guavavi and Tumacacori, at their missions. They were also miners. These are two maps of mines across Sonora, and eventually there's going to be mines up in Arizona as well. And they were skilled miners, prized for their labor. You may notice it was actually a Yaqui who discovered silver deposits at a place called Arizonac, which is where we get the name Arizona. It actually comes from a Yaqui mining discovery, which has all kind of cruel ironies for the later history that we'll talk about. So they're eventually, in some ways, welcomed north, even into the United States, because they contribute to local economies in ways that were viewed as positive by the United States. However, their reception sours. There's continual violence in Mexico. There's Yaqui uprisings in the 1820s, 30s, 50s, 60s, 1890s, in the 19-teens and 1920s. And this makes Arizonans very suspicious of these bellicose, recalcitrant, stubborn Yaquis that Spain and then Mexico has so much continual trouble with. To the north in Montana, as the fur trade collapses in the mid-19th century, the presence of mobile, unsettled Indians quickly stands at odds with the territorial project of building white settlement and economic development to make it towards statehood. So their economic presence as fur traders is no longer welcomed. In 1881, a commander wrote to Fort Assiniboine saying, "Send out as strong a force as possible under a careful officer to notify the foreign Indians to return to their own country," because they, of course, had Canadian identity. They considered that their own country, apparently. "And so prevent them from driving the game away from the hunting grounds of our own Indians." So you already see this division of our Indians in America and their Indians in Canada. One of my favorite quotes I found, this comes from a lieutenant stationed at Fort Assiniboine in 1882. He writes home to his wife. It's hard to read. His letters were not fun to go through. He didn't have very good penmanship. But he says here, "I never was as tired of a tribe as I am of this one." Speaking of the Crees, because there's this constant battle to try to push them forth north of the line. So as we have this time of economic envoys of these two groups who come into the United States with varying degrees of welcome, there eventually is going to be a new wave of immigration, that of refugees, both Cree and later and Yaqui refugees coming into the United States. In 1885, during the Northwest Rebellion, or the Riel Rebellion, led by Métis leader Louis Riel, Crees took part in a massacre at Frog Lake on the Alberta-Saskatchewan border. And to escape persecution and prosecution and potential execution, Little Bear, the son of Big Bear, who was a Cree leader who had built up quite a reputation in Montana, they flee south to Montana, across the line, while Big Bear stayed in Canada to shoulder the blame. The details of their arrival are somewhat fuzzy, but they arrive at Fort Assiniboine, and one telling says that Little Bear tried to shake hands with Colonel C.S. Otis, who refused and said, "Your hands are still bloody. I cannot shake your hand," right, because of this Frog Creek massacre. And Otis isn't sure what to do, but apparently, and again, the details are fuzzy, they receive word from Washington, D.C., that they were to be allowed to stay in Montana as political refugees. Not as Indians, but as political refugees. We've already discussed a little bit what was going on in Sonora during the turn of the century, as Yaquis were being exterminated, deported, and enslaved under very difficult conditions. And so we have these waves of thousands of Yaquis following the routes that their perhaps their own family members had already made up to Arizona as laborers, and they go north to seek asylum. Depending on when they arrived, there was a number of different immigration rulings that applied to them. As you know, in the 1920s, there's a series of immigration laws that make this quite complicated. So by the time there's a registration of Yaquis in 1940s, within a single household, you might have Yaquis to which there are 3 or 4 different immigration rulings and statuses for the people in the household, depending on when they arrived. Either they are refugees and they can stay, they're legal aliens, or which have to register, or they're illegal aliens who may be subject to deportation, perhaps all within the same household, which drives many of them underground and many of them to not kind of openly self-identify as Yaqui. They're suspicious and nervous. Eventually, both of these groups go through long processes of fighting for federal tribal recognition as American Indians, and they both do succeed. And with so many similarities between the reasons for their crossing, their reception, and a number of other things, there's an odd disparity in the chronology. Crees and Chippewas received their reservation in 1916, so roughly 30-odd years after the refugee wave had come. For Yaquis, it's not until 1978, so almost a full century. So why? What's the difference? It's kind of a question which I've gnawed on for quite some time. So I want to run through these two histories very quickly, and then we'll draw some comparative conclusions to try to understand what we learned by reading these two stories in tandem. If we begin at 1885 with the Frog Lake Massacre and their flight into Montana, we have about 36 years to look at of them living landless in Montana, moving transient around the state, living on the edges of Helena and Great Falls and Butte and other cities in Montana, literally living in city dumps, scavenging for food, starving often to death during the very difficult winter months, each consecutive winter. Native, but being denied recognition as native to Montana, not integrated into the American Indian system in Montana, but unable to participate in Montanan development as other foreign immigrants might. In 1896, then future General John J. Pershing, who you may know from your World War I history, and his Buffalo Soldiers, this is where he gets the nickname Black Jack Pershing, because he led Buffalo Soldiers in the West, in 1896 are tasked with rounding up Canadian Crees and deporting them to Canada. Most return. And the popular Cree telling is that they beat the troops back to Fort Assiniboine. They came back so quickly to Montana. In the early 1900s, Crees start joining with groups of Chippewas under the leadership of Rocky Boy, and this is where Rocky Boy's brother Penato comes in that we spoke about earlier. Various attempts are made to settle them, these Chippewas on reservations. Attempts are made to repatriate Crees to Canada, but none take. And each year, there's failures in Congress to try to come up with a solution. Each year, another looming disastrous winter. It's with the aid of Montanans like Frank Linderman, Charlie Russell, and others that they work through politicians and eventually, in 1916, do gain recognition and lands at the Fort Assiniboine Military Reserve in the Bear Paw Mountains, as had been foretold in both tribes' traditions. For Yaquis, beginning in roughly the same time period, it's going to take nearly 100 years until 1978, nearly a full century of living on the margins of Arizona society. They often blended in with Mexican immigrant communities and laborers, which is ironic because those are the very people that they're trying to escape from. They're often uncertain about their legal status. Are they allowed to be there? Many boasting family ties in Arizona that go farther back than many of the mid-20th century whites who move into Arizona during the post-World War II period. These newcomers that come in large numbers to the Sun Belt. They establish settlements and some very actually stable communities all around Arizona, over in Yuma, throughout the Tucson region, and then up in the Phoenix or the Salt River Valley. Scottsdale, Guadalupe was some of the biggest. Initially, they find ample labor, working for railroads, working for irrigation projects, picking cotton, picking citrus and other agricultural pursuits. But by the mid-20th century, many of those jobs are disappearing. Some communities gain notoriety for their religious ceremonies, the Santa Semana ceremonies during Easter. Has anyone been to Pascua for the Easter ceremonies? And they get a lot of press for that. They're recognized as uniquely indigenous, but again, they're foreign. They're not American Indians, the reports always say. They begin to organize politically in 1963, and they form a nonprofit, the Pascua Yaqui Association, which gets lands donated in the 60s for them to start building a new village and a permanent place, but not a reservation. Congressional reports at the time cited that, said, quote, "It's significant that the Yaquis are not seeking recognition by the BIA." Think in 1963, this is the tail end of the termination era, where we're terminating tribes, not creating new ones. Eventually in 1978, they do, in the mid-70s, and then successfully in 1978, they push for full tribal recognition. And that's the Pascua Yaqui tribe today, which has members not just in Tucson, but also north in the Salt River Valley. If any of you are from Phoenix, anyone here from the Phoenix Valley? I doubt, there's gotta be someone. There's one at least, right? Were you aware that there's Yaquis in your midst? So Guadalupe, which is largely viewed as a Mexican town, is a Yaqui town originally. And there are many, it's kind of a trilingual town now, English, Spanish, and Yaqui. But there are also Yaqui settlements at a number of other places. There's still a pretty strong neighborhood in South Scottsdale that's largely Yaqui. Hightown, where's Hightown? Down here, right by the, kind of over by the Chandler Mall. There's 3 little streets where the names are all in Spanish. That's an old Yaqui settlement. They're able to, many of them are tribal members as well. These are long histories, which I've spent the last decade writing a book about. So I just want to take a few minutes, though, to try to make the argument of why maybe some of you even should consider undertake studies of the border, studies of migration, but to do so in comparative context, to undertake a comparative project. It means mastering multiple historiographies, and I could have written 2 books. Maybe I should have just written 2 separate books, one about Yaquis and one about Crees and Chippewas. But I think it's worth the effort to do a comparative project. And I want to try to lay out a few reasons why, or a few things that I've come to realize through these stories. The first is how Americans viewed them and perceived them quite differently. They viewed Crees in Montana and Chippewas as largely cut from the same cloth as other native peoples in Montana and in the state. And they wanted similar outcomes for them as well. They wanted them to be confined to reservations, but specifically reserves north of the line in Canada. But they viewed them in largely similar terms as they did with Crows, Blackfeet, Gros Ventre, or others in Montana. In Arizona, however, Arizonans did not equate Yaquis with the Pimas, Navajos, Hopis, Apaches, other natives in the state of Arizona. They view them as somehow different and distinct. We also see a difference between how Americans viewed the U.S.-Canadian and U.S.-Mexican borders differently, and by extension how they viewed the indigenous peoples across those borders differently. For Montanans, there was no conflating Canadian Crees with white Canadians. If you had two groups coming down at the same time, they could categorize them into very familiar native and non-native binaries. For Arizonans, however, their view of Mexican Indians versus Mexicans was a bit more fuzzy. They were somehow, in the eyes of many Arizonans, they were somehow closer in ethnicity than in the Canadian example. So when they view Yaquis fighting against Mexicans south of the border, they read that as a civil war, instead of a war of natives versus Euro-American empire, or nation-state in that case. Interestingly, this conflation of Yaqui indigeneity with kind of this broad conception of a general Mexican ethnicity that's, if they're envisioning some kind of racial hierarchy, they're viewing Mexican ethnicity as somewhat farther down towards indigenous than it is white. This blending in some ways allowed Arizonans and Yaquis in Arizona to blend in with the very Mexican populations that they were trying to escape from. Again, as I said, a very kind of cruel irony. And these are things that that I don't think would have come to light if these stories were not being read against one another. Another key factor that came to light as I read these two histories and as I tried to figure out why there was that 36-year versus almost 100-year difference in tribal recognition was labor. And I'm not a labor historian, but it's become a key aspect of the work I've done. A key factor in Arizona Yaqui history, both in terms of where they settled, but also the reception, was that of them being a skilled labor force. And there's many reports which often describe them as the best labor force. They could be obtained for cheaper than Chinese labor, which was very popular, and for less money. And they were prized laborers as miners, railroad workers, and a number of other industries. So as Arizona Territory and later Arizona State is trying to grow its infrastructure, attract capital, attract white population, Yaqui mining, railroad workers, irrigation workers, and so forth, they were a positive contribution to Arizona's development. Their presence was therefore tolerated. And because it was tolerated, it allowed Yaquis to establish some of those settlements, stable communities, towns and villages where they could raise multiple generations. A stability that Crees in the north did not enjoy. Their skills in bison hunting and other fur trapping did not mesh with Montana's attempts to attract industry, agriculture, and population to the region. In fact, their nomadic presence was viewed as a direct impediment to the territorial project of building up towards statehood and beyond. So they were deported, or they were simply ignored. There is a labor market for natives in Montana inside of the reservation system, but they were largely denied access to that as well. When Crees joined with these Chippewas to become the Chippewa Cree tribe of the Rocky Boy Indian Reservation in 1916, one observer noted that the final success in their finding legal settlement and lands was due largely to the fact that Montanans were sick of dealing with them. They were tired of Crees wandering the state, living in their city dumps. Deportation hadn't worked, settling them on existing reservations hadn't worked, so they created a new reservation for them to quarantine their problematic presence. The observation reads, none was done about the Cree and Chippewa state of affairs for a long time, although the Indians were considered a nuisance. But people were tired of seeing this poverty at their door. It's a longer quote, but so it's not solely out of goodwill that they do give them a reservation. Ironically and cruelly, as I mentioned, Yaqui's success in integrating into Arizona labor markets allowed them to establish actual Yaqui communities and villages and with churches and annual Easter celebrations, stable communities, though they face many dire problems as their Montanan counterparts. They did have some relative success, which interestingly allowed Arizonans to ignore to ignore them and to ignore the very real problems that they faced as communities and individuals. Their narrative as being Native but not American Indian thereby stretches a full 60 years longer than the Crees and Chippewas in Montana. The history of borders, I'd like to kind of wrap up here so we have ample time for Q&A. I believe is more complicated than we imagine. And comparative methodology is a powerful way to take familiar stories, familiar borders and regions and events, things that we think we know how things played out, and to reinvestigate them. The Borderlands historian David Weber, who was trained as a Latin American, trained in the American West and in Latin American history, once said that he was always trying to serve as a middle ground, trying to get his Latin American studies cohorts to look farther north up to the American West, and trying to get his American West people to look farther south down towards Latin America. And a phrase he once used that he liked in his scholarship, to take the familiar and to make it strange. And that's something that comparative methodology and comparative history does. It makes things uncomfortable and strange as we take two stories, read them against one another, and are forced to ask questions as to why they differ so greatly. The history of immigration across borders, therefore, I think deserves a further scrutiny, and especially in comparative light. In the broader accepted narratives of borders and immigration, I'm convinced that there are more stories like those of Crees, Chippewas, and Yaquis that will defy familiar patterns, challenge us to think about the past in new ways, and also press us to consider the present in new ways. Our borders are fixed mostly, but the flows of goods and ideas and peoples across them most certainly are not. There are people around the world today seeking refuge, and sometimes that refuge is across lines that have been drawn in the sand. I would suspect that there's likely not a person in this room who does not have an ancestor, and for many of you, maybe only a couple generations back, who embarked on a perilous and uncertain journey, like these Crees and Chippewas and Yaquis did, who faced challenges upon arrival, possible rejection, who maybe lived with uncertainty and fear in a foreign land. Indeed, human history is a history of migrations and borders. It's at the core of almost all of our stories. In considering the history of these things, of borders and migration, I'm becoming increasingly aware of current affairs, viewing them with a more critical eye, also with a more compassionate eye. In Native America, there are still today unrecognized tribes. Even in Montana, there's the Little Shell tribe of Chippewas, which is a state recognized but not federally recognized. These are stories that we need to grapple with. If I could close finally in a way that I can do here at BYU and likely will not do anywhere else. In September 2016, Elder Holland gave an address. He was at a conference talking about refugees. And he said, quote, "The world needs to be more outraged than it is. When we read of the persecution, the violence, the sexual violence, the murder, the rape, the destruction of families, and of any social structure that these people have had, almost entire cultures being destroyed. The world needs to be more outraged than it is." All of those that list of things that he gave us, those are all present in Cree and Chippewa and Yaqui history. And they're present in all kinds of histories as we dig back through not just US, but world history. And unfortunately, those horrible things have not stayed in the past. We have brought them with us to the present. We have brought these horrors with us, and they continue to haunt and destroy people's lives. So I hope that when we read about these things in history, we can learn from them, gain perspective from them, and reflect on the present. Answer a call that was issued quite a time before Elder Jeffrey R. Holland, when it was said, quote, "Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as ye have done unto the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me." I believe there is significant work to be done in this world, to heed the Savior's call to make the world a more tolerable place for his children. A key place that we can do that is to study and better understand these fraught histories and our collective human histories of borders and migration. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. For the benefit of our listening and recording audience, we ask that you come and use the microphone up over here. If you're a BYU student, tell us who you are and what you're studying.
Hi, my name is Brittany Bear. I'm a political science major here at BYU. I was wondering, should history term the demise of the Native American culture and population as a genocide? And if so, why? And if not, why?
Wow. All right. We'll just dig right into this. My master's thesis, which I wrote back in 2006, was on this topic, on genocide studies and comparative genocide studies with the Jewish Holocaust and other things. And it's something I've been grappling with for a long time. And at the time, I was kind of making a call saying that we need more good, objective scholarship in Native America to describe what happened so we can understand, was it a genocide or was it not? And thankfully, there have been a number of really amazing books which have come out, which demonstrate that in some very specific instances, it does meet all of the UN definitions for genocide. I would refer you to Benjamin Madley's book that recently came out called An American Genocide, The California Indian Catastrophe, or Brendan Lindsay's book, Murder State. Both of those are about California. But more broadly speaking about the whole of Native America, regardless of what pre-contact population estimates you accept, there's a dramatic overall population decline that takes place over the course of centuries, involving multiple European and then American nations, and hundreds, if not thousands, of unique indigenous peoples. And so it's difficult to use a blanket genocide term to apply to that whole 500-year history. But in some specific examples, it's I think very clearly genocide, and other times flirting with it in many ways.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Question for you. Sam Waterstrom in geography. So looking at this relationship with borders with Mexico and Canada and the indigenous people, how do you kind of touched on it a little bit, but how do you relate that to with borders of Indian reservations? And because a lot of times the Indians have been pushed to these reservations, and then sometimes they want to be outside of them, and how that relates to the same idea.
Yeah, so especially at the early stages when reservations are established, many Native peoples were not free to leave the reservation. It was very much they were confined there and forcibly confined there. It's in that context that the 1880s and 90s ghost dance develops, and the Wounded Knee Massacre is in the context of Natives being off reservation. So you can take a lot of the framework that we use in Borderlands history, and you can apply it to reservation borders and the very real differences about being on one side of that line and the other. You can apply it to state borders. I always encourage my students to think of it really broadly, and you can talk about religious and cultural borderlands and boundaries. I think it's a fruitful way to think about a lot of things. But on Native reservation borders, especially, if you look down at a place like Phoenix, where there's a number of reservations which have now been almost completely surrounded by kind of the growing suburban sprawl. It's a striking difference between the two. Currently, they're trying to build a freeway around the south side of Phoenix and South Mountain, which abuts with, I think it's the Gila River Reservation. And there's been, but the borderline is right where they want to put the freeway. And there's been all kinds of very, very nasty fights and a lot of acrimony and a lot of bad feelings on both sides, as this growing kind of general American population has abutted directly to native sovereign lands, and lots of disagreements across those lines. I don't know if that's really answering your question, but
that's the whole idea of what's reservation. Is another country, as a sovereign, you put that word out there.
Yeah, Chief Justice John Marshall said they're domestic dependent nations, that they are sovereign nations, but domestic, which is oxymoronic. So they are their own sovereign nations, but they have an official relationship with the federal government, and they are also U.S. citizens and state citizens and tribal citizens. It's very complicated. Yeah.
Good, thank you.
My name is Grant Cagle. I'm a Latin American Studies major. I have a pretty similar question. You said that they were down in Arizona and that they wanted to make a reservation, but they weren't allowed, so they had settlements. And you also said that they were kind of pushed into reservations because they didn't want to be dealt with. So what benefits came to the Cree Nation as they joined with the Chippewa?
Yeah, so what benefits are there in federal recognition and then receiving reservation lands? Well, for the Crees and Chippewas, it gave them a place to live. Whereas many of these Yaquis, they already had settlements and homes and neighborhoods that they were living in. But with federal tribal recognition comes a large array of services. As many of these native peoples suffered similar processes in their relationships with the United States, many of them have signed treaties with the United States ceding lands that in return the U.S. government agreed by treaty, although rarely did it fully uphold its treaty obligations, to provide certain services, the Indian health services, all kinds of things. And so getting tribal recognition gives them access to that. But it was very different. For the Crees, it was that they needed land. They needed a place to live so they weren't homeless. For Yaquis in 1978, it was gaining access to some of the benefits of being officially involved with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Is that?
It does. So if
Yeah.
I understand you correctly, everyone outside of their community wanted to just kind of push them to the side, and so they would support them in getting a reservation?
In Montana, that was a general feeling. Montanan papers were constantly complaining about these Crees. They're such a trouble. Now they're in the city dump again. What should we do about them? Let's deport them. We got to get rid of them. Get rid of them. And eventually, this idea comes up. Like, look, there's this land up there that's going to be divvied up for white settlement. How about we take a few townships and give it to them? It's the people who are bringing it to Congress were saying it's the right thing to do. But some of the general Montana population was also thinking it also gets rid of this problem and allows us to quarantine it up, up by Havre.
So for lack of better words, it was a win-win, except for that they were confined, and if they left, they were persecuted?
Yeah, by 1916, some of the regulations about leaving reservations had loosened up on some reservations. So it plays out a little bit differently at that point. Late 19th century is when they really are locked down on other reservations.
Thank you.
I know some people have to leave for class if someone needs to go to class at 12. I'm happy to stay though if there's more questions.
More questions?
Jeff Shumway, History Department and Latin American Studies.
I thought you looked familiar.
Yeah. So how do you balance in your work the role of these people as agents of themselves and also victims of others? Because in your narrative, we in academia, we see victims who are also victimizing. I mean, it's kind of an interesting mix. You have Mexican settlers versus Yaquis, and then on a border where, U.S. pressures are pressuring both of those groups. And so how do you balance all of
Yeah, and this is something any scholars who are dealing with Native topics need to grapple with. If you go back to a different generation of scholars, Native peoples were largely acted upon. Or perhaps if they were acting on their own, they were acting in reaction to outside pressures or things. And one of the big movements in modern indigenous scholarship is that of giving them real agency and treating them as real people as we do with other groups, and allowing them to, in the stories we're telling about them, that they're acting for a variety of reasons, not always in reaction to, simply what white populations are doing. I mean, sometimes when we talk about 1492 and contact with Columbus and then contact with other European nations is that Native America was this, like a trap that had been all wound up, right? And it was sitting there static. Columbus and whites arrived, and the trap is sprung, and the whole place bursts into chaos, right? But that robs Native peoples of their historic agency, that they were always moving and negotiating with each other in military ways, economic ways, cultural and linguistic ways, and all of those facets of their agency and how they're running their lives need to then also go throughout the period when they're interacting with I want to say us, but with white Americans. And that's one reason why I wanted to share those two stories at the beginning, was to give us some humanity, some faces and names of people making decisions in their lives. Because sometimes, especially when you're doing these broad borderland studies, or even worse, when you're doing broad comparative studies, it's easy to lose narrative, to lose the stories of individual people making decisions as you're talking about these kind of big picture items. So it's a constant struggle. I probably didn't do it very well in the book, and actually I for a while toyed with the idea of just telling one narrative story and then telling the other narrative story instead of doing them as comparatively, because I was worried about losing a sense of agency for Native peoples. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's something I grapple with and I struggle with. It's kind of like have you heard of the Bechdel test in film or literature? Are there ever two women on screen who are having a conversation with one another that doesn't refer to a man or isn't in reaction to something a man did? If you're talking about feminist film or feminist literature. And even many films that we view as like very kind of women-forward, women-positive films do not pass the Bechdel test. And you can sometimes apply that to writing about Native peoples. And the other issue is to let Native peoples tell their own story, and to take them at their word for the ways they interpret their own history and past. That's an important thing I try to weave in.
Any other questions? All right, please join me in thanking you.
Thank you.